Could 2018 be the year when the war in Syria finally ends? Bashar Al Assad is confident his regime is no longer threatened after Russia helped him turn the tide. But after the military gains, what kind of political settlement is possible? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. As 2018 dawns, we're examining a story that has dominated headlines for the better part of the past 6 years. Syria is on many minds because of the millions either dead, wounded, or made refugees. 2017 was a good year for President Bashar Al Assad as forces recaptured major cities and large areas of rebel-held territory. The Russian resort of Sochi is due to host a new round of talks in January. But after so many failed negotiations, the prospect of peace remains elusive. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, Zaina Khud reports from Beirut.
Syrians in search of safety. There may be less violence because of Russian-brokered local ceasefires, but there are still active front lines in some areas of the country. Over the past year, the opposition lost sizable territory, and the Syrian government, with the backing of Russia and Iran, have also recaptured areas from ISIL. The government is stronger than it has been since the conflict began nearly 7 years ago, but the war is not nearing its end.
The war is far from over, that is for sure. What we're seeing is perhaps winding down a bit of the conflict in some parts. There is a likelihood of an escalation or flare-up in further conflicts in other parts of the country.
Almost a quarter of the country in the northeast, for example, is outside the state's control. The mainly Kurdish region wants a federal system for Syria. The government once said it would be ready to discuss this, but now it calls the Kurds traitors for working with a foreign country. And the U.S. decision to maintain a troop presence in the enclave has alarmed Russia, which says there is no legitimate reason for them to stay.
The war is not over, but the focus is already on dividing the spoils. Russia's President Vladimir Putin wants to play a lead role in brokering a political settlement. The Kremlin has successfully created an alternative path for negotiations. The Russian-led talks in Astana have overshadowed the UN-led Geneva process.
And now Putin plans to host a Syrian peace conference in Sochi. Russia's leader says he has the support of Iran and Turkey, countries that are deeply involved in the conflict. He also says Syria's President Bashar Al Assad is backing the peace initiative that may weaken his powers but leave him in office for at least a few years with a reformed constitution.
What we will likely see is a Syria not divided, but divided in terms of spheres of influence. It will be like a multinational company with countries holding shares, and of course Russia having the biggest share.
A political settlement is still a long way off. For opponents of the government, what is being discussed doesn't amount to peace, but priorities have changed. In 2017, calls for Assad to be removed from power were no longer heard. Western leaders now seem to be more concerned with working with Russia to counter Iran's growing influence in Syria. Sana Khuder, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Let's now bring in our guests. Joining us in Istanbul, Yahya Aridi, spokesman for the Syrian Negotiating Committee. In Moscow, Alexey Khlebnikov, his Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. And in Beirut, Sami Nader, director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs. Welcome to you all. Mr. Al-Aridi, I would like to ask you this question. 2013, the general sentiment among the opposition were just a few inches from gaining the war. Now, the general sentiment is the opposition is losing the war against Bashar al-Assad. How do you react to this?
Well, I don't think that the opposition is losing the war, because originally the intention of the opposition was not a military one in the first place. It was just a matter of a scream for certain rights. And the regime, on the other hand, has selected the military solution for this issue. And so far, the military solution has proven to be a real failure. And what attests to this fact is that all those attempts to find a political settlement for the crisis in Syria, and on top, Russia is exerting all the efforts to find a political settlement. Unfortunately, Russia is just approaching this issue by the same means it used for the military solution after its interference in 2015. And that's why it is having real problems in finding this settlement or in finding a solution. In other words, the Syrian case is one of rights of a political solution rather than a military one, because the military solution has really proven to be a disastrous matter due to the fact that it has devastated the country, displaced its people, and without getting any results for any settlement. And the regime doesn't feel confident, as you reported in your report, in your introduction, which is, I believe, a misconception of the situation. Because of the Iranian element, the Iranian factor and the Russian factor, the regime is still there. How could it feel confident?
Okay, Mr. Aridi, we'll go back into more details about the different players in the conflict. Mr. Khlebnikov, the Russians are pushing for a political settlement. Does it come from this sentiment that they consider the war almost to be over?
So, well, indeed, from the Russian perspective and other leaders of other countries like Iran, Iraq, Syrian government, even the United States, they acknowledge that the ISIS is almost defeated in Syria and Iraq. So currently Russia wants to concentrate more on the political process. And that's to the contrary that the majority think. The political process is even trickier and harder than the military phase. Firstly, because the sides, all parties, will face an issue to discuss the most sensitive and difficult problems like constitutional and political reforms, elections, the fate of Assad, the role of Kurds in the country's governance, the presence of the foreign military formations in its territory. So there is the whole set of these political issues which really put Russia on a tight spot. Because on the one hand, it has its allies in Damascus and in Iran, and on the other hand, you have these kind of rivalry powers as Turkey and Israel and the United States, which push for a different one. So Russia, it's really tricky for it to balance between them.
Between those two things. Mr. Nader, I mean, the Syrian opposition has recently said that it's going to establish a new national army. But when you look at the situation on the ground, the rebels are losing significant ground. They're no longer in the eastern part of the country. The outskirts of Damascus is almost entirely under the control of the government, except of some few pockets in the eastern Ghouta. They are left with one province, which is Idlib. But then that ground itself is very vulnerable. Do you still believe that the rebels can still stage a military comeback?
I mean, a military comeback, no. And this is not the major strength of the opposition, because based on the balance of power, there is nothing to compare between the Russian military force that saved the regime and the capabilities that are in the hand of the opposition. However, the strength of this opposition is political, because there is no alternative to the Syrian opposition, and any opposition that is made or invented by the Syrian regime or its allies will not pave the way for a sustainable solution. A sustainable solution can only be reached with the participation of the legitimate opposition that unified itself recently. So it's true that we can talk about a Russian victory in Syria, military victory. However, this victory should be sustainable.
Okay.
And the way to this is, I mean, to reach a political settlement, and no political settlement is achievable without the presence and the participation of a legitimate Syrian opposition.
Let's delve into the issue of the political settlements. Mr. Al-Aridi, you said that you're not going to attend the Sochi summit. What are the options left for you if you don't want to be part of a broader, comprehensive political settlement led by the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians?
Well, it's not a matter of saying yes to what Russia intends to hold in Sochi or saying no. The issue is one of investigating this particular initiative by the Russians. As I told you previously, that Russia believes that it can solve the problems politically as it thinks that it solved them militarily. You cannot use the same means and tools to approach the political settlement. There, Russia has no parallel, no compatible power in the field. It has jets all over the place. It just used Syria as a test field for its weapons.
Mr. Al-Aridi, what's your problem with the Russian initiative? They would like you to negotiate a political transition. They want Bashar Al Assad to stay in power, and they say that you are welcome to be part of a broader political establishment, but you won't be the only one to have the bigger say. What is your problem with this perspective?
Okay, well, fine. That's we have to discuss then the nature of this initiative or this invitation to Sochi Congress. First, Russia has put a precondition for those attendees, those who are going to attend it. First, they cannot discuss the fate of Assad and his regime. They cannot talk about political transition, and they have to be certain members who are along the same line with the regime's tendencies for a political settlement. In other words, they are the product of the inside and whatever the intelligence needs. Another thing is that this particular Congress, if it just jumps over UN Security Council resolutions upon which a political settlement is to be achieved in Syria, if they are sidelined, no one could just go to a submission for the Russian occupation of Syria and for the continuation of brutality, dictatorship in Syria, because this dictatorship has proven to be the best prescription for the continuity of tension, for the continuity of terrorism, and at the same time it is a complete block for any possibility for reconstructing Syria and bringing back those who were displaced or dispersed all over the world, Syrians. And this is a source for tension. If Congress, if Sochi is as such, no one would go to. And you notice also this tide of Syrian opposition towards Sochi, and it is considered to be a submission for the Russian will.
I see your point.
This cannot be the case.
Let's further expand our discussion. Mr. Khlebnikov, how can, you've heard what Mr. Al-Aridi has been saying, particularly voicing the concerns of the Syrian opposition. How can the Russians repackage the whole initiative in Sochi to be able to bring it in a very appealing way to the Syrian opposition, but also to the international community? Are the Russians willing to consider the fate of Bashar al-Assad?
Well, in the first place, I want to say that Russia didn't, I mean, the only precondition Russia put for this Congress is that all parties participate shouldn't have any preconditions for the negotiations. So, secondly, I think we should look at this initiative in the same way as at Astana. In the very beginning, if you remember, also the major and really big part of the opposition on the ground didn't want to participate in it. But gradually, they started to be involved more and more, and we all witnessed the results and effectiveness of Astana talks, which resulted in making ceasefires.
But
designing de-escalation zones.
You know, as we know, that was largely due to the Turkish intervention, which spoke with the opposition and told them, we would like you to go there, hoping that that deal would be conducive to a political settlement. Now everyone is upset. The Turks themselves are saying Bashar al-Assad is a terrorist. He must go. He has no future in any political settlement.
Okay, look, Erdogan was saying different things at different times. He's switching his opinions and attitudes quite often. So I don't think we should take it as a true words and true approach, but definitely it's might be some play behind that. But of course, I mean, we already have Russian, Iranians, Turks behind this Congress. We already have Staffan de Mistura, the UN Syrian envoy, who supports this idea, and probably now it's discussions that he and the UN representatives will also be present in Sochi. So this is why I won't agree with my colleague in Istanbul that this Congress is aimed at kind of taking over Geneva or replacing Geneva. In no way it has such goal. Instead, quite the opposite.
Okay. Mr. Nader, if this is something which is going to be a parallel path, we should, I think, give a chance to the Russians in a way or another, because Geneva has been there for ages, but with absolutely no way out of this crisis. Many consider Geneva to be a total failure. Why don't we give the Russians an opportunity?
I mean, as long as the Sochi will come with an end in mind and it can depict a solution, a sustainable solution for Syria, yes, why not? Because even the Russians are saying that Sochi is not in contradiction with the Geneva process, is complementary. But up to now, we don't see the end in mind. This crisis, the solution for this crisis is easy and difficult at the same time, because it relies on one point that is today a point of conflict, which is the fate of Mr. Assad, that opened the way for the transition period. And this point, no one up to now has been able to resolve. And actually, whether Sochi or Geneva, as long as it does not tackle the core of this issue, which is the conflicting issue, so no Sochi or no Geneva or other process will reach a happy end.
Okay, Mr. Al-Aridi, you remember in Geneva, even with the help of the international community, the French, the Americans, the British, the key players in the Gulf countries, and also Turkey, the moment you got to the point of transitional period and the future of the country, it stalled, because everyone was scared about the idea of another Syria without Bashar al-Assad. How can you convince the international community this time that a Syria without Bashar al-Assad is good for everyone?
Well, the international community doesn't have a problem with that. The problem really lies with Russia itself. Had there been a Russian will towards implementing UN Security Council resolutions, be they the Geneva Communique or the Resolution 2254, I think that Geneva could have a chance. However, I wanted just to refer back to what your guest from Moscow, our colleague from Moscow, said regarding Astana. Astana was meant to be a military and humanistic matter, just for de-escalation and for the detainees to be released, for siege to be lifted, and for aid to get to those besieged areas. None of those goals were achieved as they were intended to be, unfortunately. However, Russia wanted to use also the platform of Astana to politicize it when they introduced the constitution, a Syrian constitution, in one of the rounds, and it was rejected. And it found just Astana to be not quite helpful in just going into that political track. And that's why this Sochi matter was invented. We can say that national dialogue was mentioned in 2254, but ask me who is supposed to carry out such a political dialogue. It is the political transition body that is to be formed after a political transition takes place. Russia wants to find a political settlement for Syria, but not through these means and tools. If it is really and seriously and strategically determined to find a solution, it is not through these tactics or those three through these means. It has to go into the things quite seriously and say, well, we need to find a political transition, and we can carry on a political national dialogue inside Syria rather in Sochi or in any other place. peace. Geneva can also find a chance if Russia has a real good, determined will.
Mr. Khlebnikov, do you think that the Russians, the Turks and the Iranians can sit together, set their differences aside and work towards a comprehensive political settlement despite the conflicting agendas there in Syria?
Any negotiations are better than their absence. That's the first point. Secondly, we already witnessed that in this over 2017, Russia, Turkey and Iran has managed to reach certain agreements and reach certain successes in Syria. And I think it laid the quite solid foundation for their future discussions. However, as I already indicated in the beginning, that the political track is even more complex and more complicated than the military one. So here I would expect that the risk of increasing tensions between Russia and Iran, Russia and Turkey is increasing. And it's way bigger than during the military phase of the conflict. As for the prospects, that would also depend on how Russia would push and pressure Assad's government. So definitely Russia is interested in quite fast political resolution because it needs to demonstrate its successes. Because if it fails to deliver on its promises, its image as a capable partner which can keep its allies in Syria, in Damascus in check would be damaged.
Okay, Mr. Nader, let's talk a little bit about one of the key players who's been a little bit distancing itself from the Syrian conflict, which is the United States of America. Can the Americans this time bring about a significant change to the course of this conflict?
I mean, definitely since the Trump administration came to power, they invested more militarily in Syria, which is giving them today more leverage than they used to have before 2016. But I think that the American approach towards the Syria or the Syrian solution is more of a decentralized solution, if we can put it in these terms. They are trying to consolidate or to transform this area of demilitarization or de-escalation zone into empowering new administration council. But this, at the same time, doesn't offer a comprehensive solution for Syria, one that take into consideration the constitution and the transition period and the fate of Mr. Assad. And one major impediment, I think, to this solution is we didn't talk about Iran's role. And given the current international situation and the conflict which is increasing between the United States and Iran, between Arab states and Iran, could make a solution in Syria very challenging in the year to come.
Mr. Al-Aridi, this is going to be my last question. You've lost significant ground, you are undermined, and you are divided. However, do you see yourself in the future sitting with Bashar al-Assad negotiating the future of your country?
Well, in the last Geneva round, the 8th one, we really wanted that to happen, but the regime ran away from that because simply it has been all along determined to find a solution through military means, which doesn't work. However, it talks about in the media about a political solution when in reality this doesn't suit it. Because talking about a political settlement means the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions.
Thank you.
And they talk about political transition, whether they want it or not.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Yahya Al-Aridi, Mr. Alexey Khlebnikov, and Mr. Sami Nader. Thank you for your presence and for your contribution. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here, bye for now.